You don't belong at this table. Vivian Ashcroft didn't look up. She kept signing papers. This is a board meeting, Mr. Holloway. Security will walk you out. Dean Holloway stood at the end of the table. He held a thick report under his arm. Grease still marked one of his fingers from the morning shift. His jacket was old and worn. I asked for this meeting 3 times, Dean said. You promised me 10 minutes. We changed our minds, Preston Callahan said, smiling slightly. There's a problem with the KX-47 stabilizer. It's in the report, page 11. Someone needs to read it before we sell it to airlines. Vivian finally looked up. Her eyes were cold. You fix rental cars before this job. That's in your file. I certified aircraft for 6 years. Not anymore, she said. The line is 41 days behind. We have investors flying in today, and you want to tell me the whole system is broken because of your gut feeling? It's not a feeling, Dean said. I tested it 200 times. It fails in strong crosswinds, at low altitude. That's when it matters most. You tested it, Preston said, because you wanted attention. Nobody in the room disagreed. A few directors looked at their phones. Preston stood up. He walked over and took the badge off Dean's jacket. He picked up a pair of scissors from the desk. He cut the badge in half. It landed on the table, split down the middle. Nobody laughed. The room stayed silent. Dean picked up both pieces of his badge. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. One day you'll wish you read the last page, he said. That day isn't coming, Vivian answered. He turned and walked out of the room. If you love watching arrogance meet a truth it never saw coming, subscribe now, because what happens to Vivian Ashcroft in the next 29 minutes is going to leave you speechless. Stay with this story. Dean Holloway lived in a small rented house on the edge of Renton, Washington. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a leaking faucet he never had time to fix. His daughter, Mia, was 9 years old. Her mother had passed away when Mia was 4. Since then, it had been just the 2 of them. Every morning, Dean woke up at 5. He made breakfast before Mia woke up. Oatmeal, sometimes eggs when there was extra money that week. He packed her lunch himself, wrote a small note on the napkin most days. Nothing fancy, just have a good day or I love you, kid. He drove her to school at 7:15. Then he drove straight to Kingsley Arrow, where his shift started at 8. He worked in the maintenance bay, inspecting aircraft systems, running diagnostics, fixing what needed fixing. He was good at his job, better than good, but nobody at Kingsley Arrow saw him that way. To the engineers upstairs, Dean was just a mechanic, a man who fixed things with his hands, not a man who understood the systems he was fixing. He didn't have a fancy degree. He didn't wear a suit. He wore the same worn jacket most days because he didn't have money for new ones. Every extra dollar went toward Mia, her school supplies, her shoes, a tutor twice a month for math because she struggled with it and he wanted her to feel confident. Dean never complained about any of this. He never asked for a raise he thought he didn't deserve. He never told anyone at work about Mia, about the nights he stayed up late after she went to bed, studying old aircraft manuals just to understand every system better than the day before. He kept that part of himself quiet. At work, people walked past him without a second look. Engineers with degrees from expensive schools would ask him to run tests, then take the results into meetings without ever mentioning his name. He didn't fight it. He believed that doing the work right mattered more than getting credit for it. Some evenings, after Mia was asleep, Dean sat at the kitchen table with old aircraft blueprints spread out in front of him. He studied balance systems, stabilizer designs, flight control software. Nobody told him to do this. Nobody paid him for it. He did it because he believed that one day understanding these systems completely would matter. He had no idea how soon that day would come.
It started on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the meeting where his badge was cut in half. Dean was running a routine diagnostic on a KX-47 stabilizer unit, the same test he had run 100 times before on earlier models. The test was supposed to take 20 minutes. He had done it so many times he could almost do it without thinking. But this time, something was different. At the very end of the test, when the simulation pushed the aircraft through a strong crosswind at low altitude, The numbers on his screen paused for less than a second, then they corrected themselves. To most people, that pause would mean nothing. Test software glitched sometimes. Screens froze for a moment and then caught up. Dean did not move on. He sat there, staring at the screen, replaying what he had just seen in his mind. A pause like that, in that exact moment of the test, was not normal. He had run this exact simulation enough times to know what normal looked like. He brought it to Grant the next morning. Grant looked at the data for less than a minute. "It's a timing artifact," Grant said. "Test rigs do that sometimes. Don't worry about it." Dean wasn't convinced. He ran the test a third time, then a fourth. Same result, every single time, in the exact same spot. He brought it to Grant again. This time, Grant sighed, clearly annoyed. "Dean, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what a real problem looks like, and this isn't one. You're seeing something that isn't there." Dean didn't argue, but he didn't stop testing either. Over the next several nights, after Mia was asleep, he ran the simulation again and again on his own laptop, using data he was allowed to access. 200 times, he later told the board. 200 times the same pause appeared, always right before the crosswind correction. He began to understand what it meant. In extreme conditions, at low altitude, during a strong crosswind, the system would briefly hesitate before it corrected itself. On a calm day, no one would ever notice. In an emergency, that hesitation could cost seconds nobody would have to spare. He wrote it all down, every test, every number, every timestamp. He built a full report, page by page, until it was 2 inches thick. Then he asked for a meeting with Vivian Ashcroft. Dean's request for a meeting sat untouched for 6 days before anyone responded. In the meantime, he kept working, kept running the diagnostic, kept documenting every result. He told himself that once someone with real authority looked at the numbers, they would see what he saw. He did not understand yet that some people had already decided what they wanted to see long before the numbers arrived. Sterling Wainwright, a chief financial officer, had a different problem. The KX-47 line was behind schedule, and a deal with a company called Blackthorn Capital depended on that line staying on track. If the KX-47 passed certification on time, Sterling stood to receive a bonus large enough to change his life. If it was delayed, that bonus disappeared, and so did his chance to sell his shares in Kingsley Aero at their highest value. Sterling did not want a flaw. He wanted a signature.
When Dean's report first reached Sterling's desk, Sterling read the first 2 pages, then stopped. He called Grant Pierce into his office. "Is there anything real here?" Sterling asked. "Or is this a mechanic wasting everyone's time?" Grant, still annoyed from his earlier conversations with Dean, told Sterling what he wanted to hear. "It's a testing artifact, nothing more. He's reading too much into a glitch." That was enough for Sterling. He did not need to hear anything else. Over the following days, small changes were made to internal test records, changes nobody outside a narrow circle knew about. Warnings that had been logged were quietly removed. A note was added to Dean's personnel file, describing him as difficult, resistant to feedback, prone to exaggeration. When Dean tried to reach Vivian Ashcroft directly, he was turned away at her office door twice. Her assistant told him she was too busy, that his concerns had already been reviewed by the engineering team. The truth was, nobody with real authority had reviewed anything at all. They had reviewed a summary written by someone who already decided Dean was wrong. Meanwhile, the KX-47 line kept moving. Confidence in the system grew with every unit that rolled off the assembly floor without incident. Executives spoke about the upcoming contracts with growing certainty. Reports circulated showing strong testing results, results built on data that no longer told the whole story. To everyone in the building except Dean, the KX-47 looked like Kingsley Aero's greatest success in years. Dean kept his own copies of the original data. He didn't know exactly why he did it. He simply felt wrong to let the only accurate version of the truth exist in a system someone else controlled. He requested one more meeting with Vivian Ashcroft. This time his request was approved. It was the meeting where his badge would be cut in half. The night before his meeting with the board, Dean sat at his kitchen table long after Mia had gone to bed. The blueprints of the KX-47 stabilizer were spread out in front of him, next to 200 pages of his own test results. He noticed something he had missed before. The pause in the system did not happen randomly. It happened at a very specific combination of altitude and wind speed, a combination rare enough that it might not occur during a routine flight for years, but when it did occur, it would almost certainly happen during takeoff or landing, the two moments that a plane had the least room for error. He pulled up the maintenance logs from 3 regional airlines that had already received early KX-47 units. He was not supposed to have these logs anymore, but his old credentials had not been removed yet. Buried in one report from a small airline in Idaho, a pilot had written a brief note after a rough landing during a windstorm. The plane had drifted briefly to one side before straightening out on its own. The pilot described it as unusual, but nothing went wrong, so the note was filed away and forgotten.
Dean read that note 4 times. To everyone else, it looked like nothing. To him, it looked exactly like what his tests had predicted. He also noticed something else. The internal test data he had once submitted had changed. 2 of his original warnings were missing from the official file. A note had been added to his personnel record that he had never seen before, calling him difficult and resistant to feedback. He did not know who had changed the data. He only knew that someone had. He made a decision that night. He copied everything: the original blueprints, his raw test results with their real timestamps, the internal messages where he had asked for a formal review, and the altered file showing what had been removed. He saved it all to a drive that belonged only to him. He did not do this out of anger. He did it the same way he double-checked a bolt he had already tightened. It was simply what a careful person did. He looked at the photograph of Mia taped to the corner of his laptop screen, and he thought about what it would mean if he said nothing and something happened to one of those planes. The next morning, he walked into the meeting with his full report, believing that if he simply showed the board the truth, they would listen. He did not yet know that the board had already decided the truth did not matter. Act 6. The Moment of Proof. 381 days later, Dean sat in his office at Cole Meridian Aviation in front of the file Vivian Ashcroft had just sent him. 600 megabytes of raw telemetry from the grounded Spokane fleet, timestamps intact, or so the file claimed. He had 4 minutes left before the FAA's compliance window closed. He opened the data and went straight to the crosswind correction logs, the same place he had found the pause a year earlier. It took him less than 90 seconds to find what he was looking for. The same hesitation, the same failure pattern he had tried to explain to a room of people who had already stopped listening. But this time there was more. The KX-47 units in Spokane were newer models, built after Dean left the company. Someone had tried to patch the original flaw without understanding what caused it. The patch had not fixed the problem. It had made it worse, creating the comma-shaped burn mark on the stabilizer housing, a visible scar left behind when the system tried to correct itself twice in the same instant and failed both times. Dean called Vivian back with 40 seconds left on the clock. "It's the same flaw," he said. "Someone tried to patch it without fixing the root cause. I can walk your team through the correct fix right now, but you need to tell the FAA the truth in the next 30 seconds or you lose your certification today." Tell them what exactly? Tell them Kingsley Aero identified a known defect in the crosswind correction system and that a qualified expert is already implementing a permanent fix. That's not a lie. It's the first true thing anyone at your company has said about this system in over a year. Vivian did not hesitate this time. She relayed the statement to her compliance officer, who read it to the FAA representative with 11 seconds to spare. Over the next 6 hours, Dean walked a team of Ash Grove engineers through the correct fix, the one he had designed a year earlier but never gotten the chance to implement.
By early afternoon, the first corrected unit passed testing. By evening, all 41 aircraft in Spokane were inspected and cleared to fly. The fix worked. It worked completely, immediately, and without argument from anyone watching the numbers scroll across the screen. For the first time in over a year, engineers who had once dismissed Dean's warnings sat in silence, watching numbers confirm exactly what he had told them from the beginning. Vivian called him again that evening. Her voice was different this time, quieter. "You saved the fleet," she said. "I saved the fleet a year ago, too." Nobody was listening then.
Fixing the Spokane fleet should have ended it there. It did not. 2 days after the aircraft were cleared to fly, Maris Whitaker, Dean's attorney, called him with something she had found while preparing the paperwork for Cole Meridian's involvement in the Ash Grove restructuring. "The patch," she said, "the one that caused the burn marks. I pulled the internal approval records. It wasn't authorized by engineering. It was pushed through by Preston Callahan 6 weeks ago without a full safety review." Dean sat with that for a moment. Why would he approve a patch without a review? Because a full review would have taken months. Ash Grove had a deadline. Preston had a deal with Blackthorn Capital riding on that deadline, the same way he had a bonus riding on the KX-47 deadline last year. It was the same pattern, a financial deadline pushing a technical decision that should have taken months into a decision made in weeks. The only difference was the scale. 41 aircraft this time, not one report gathering dust in a drawer. Dean kept digging. Blackthorn Capital, it turned out, had quietly purchased a significant portion of Ash Grove's outstanding debt 18 months earlier, long before Dean's firing. They had been positioning themselves to acquire the company at a discount for over a year, and a grounded fleet, followed by a collapsed stock price, was exactly the kind of crisis that made an acquisition look like a rescue. Preston had not just covered up one flaw to protect one bonus. He had been quietly steering the company to a cliff for over a year, first by silencing Dean, then by rushing an unauthorized patch, each decision serving the same outside interest. Dean brought the findings to Vivian directly. She read through the documents Maris had prepared without speaking for a long time. "He's been doing this since before you were fired," she finally said. "Since before I ever found the flaw," Dean said. "I just happened to be the first person in the way." Vivian sat back in her chair, and for the first time since the phone call in Hangar 6, Dean saw something in her face that looked less like fear of losing the company and more like the slow, uncomfortable realization that she had trusted the wrong person for a very long time. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "The truth, all of it, not just about the fleet, about what happened to me and about what Preston has been doing since." Vivian did not answer right away, but she did not argue either. The board meeting was called for the following Monday in the same glass conference room where Dean's badge had been cut in half 388 days earlier. Dean walked in wearing the same kind of plain jacket he always wore, no suit, no performance. Maris Whitaker walked beside him carrying a folder with everything they had found. Preston Callahan was already seated when they arrived. He didn't know yet why the meeting had been called. Vivian stood at the head of the table, the same place she had stood the day she fired him. This time, she didn't wait for anyone else to speak first. "A year ago, I stood in this room and called Dean Holloway a liability," she said. "I told him this company had no room for a single father who showed up with theories instead of results. I was wrong. I want that on the record before anything else is said today." Preston shifted in his seat. "Vivian, whatever this is about—"
"It's about the patch you approved 6 weeks ago," she said. "The same patch that caused 41 aircraft to sit grounded in Spokane and nearly cost this company its FAA certification." Maris placed a folder in front of each board member. Inside was the approval record showing Preston's signature, the timeline showing the review had been skipped, and financial records showing Blackthorn Capital's ownership of Ash Grove's debt, purchased more than a year before Dean was ever fired. The room went quiet the way it had gone quiet the day Dean's badge was cut in half. But this time, the silence was aimed at someone else. "You knew," one of the directors said to Preston. "You knew about the original flaw when Dean brought it to you, and you buried it." Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no summary he could offer that would explain away a signature with his own name on it. "I did what was necessary to protect this company's timeline," he finally said. "You did what was necessary to protect your bonus," Dean said quietly. "The company almost paid for it with 41 aircraft and everyone on board them." Nobody laughed this time. Nobody looked away either. Vivian turned to the board. "I'm placing Preston Callahan on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. I'm also asking that Dean Holloway's personnel file be corrected to reflect what actually happened a year ago, and that this board issue a public statement acknowledging the original flaw, how it was mishandled, and the steps we're taking with Cole Meridian Aviation to make sure it never happens again." The vote passed without a single objection. Word of the meeting reached the factory floor within the hour. Workers who had watched Dean walk out with a severed badge over a year ago now watched him walk through the same building as the chairman of the company that had just saved their jobs. Some of them lowered their eyes, not out of disrespect, but out of quiet shame for the day they had stayed silent. Dean did not hold it against any of them. He understood what it cost a person to speak up in a room that had already decided not to listen. 6 months later, Kingsley Arrow, now operating under a restructuring agreement with Cole Meridian Aviation, delivered its first fully corrected KX-47 unit. No shortcuts, no skipped reviews. Every stage of testing documented and verified by an independent team, with full authority to stop the line the moment something looked wrong, a power that would have gotten someone fired under the old leadership. Preston Callahan was formally removed from the company following the investigation. Blackthorn Capital withdrew its acquisition offer once the debt manipulation came to light, and Conrad Blackthorn stopped returning calls from anyone at Ashgrove entirely. Vivian Ashcroft remained chief executive, but she ran the company differently now. She sat in on engineering reviews instead of skipping them. She read full reports instead of summaries. When a young inspector flagged a minor inconsistency in a routine test 6 weeks into the new system, Vivian did not dismiss it. She had it checked immediately. It turned out to be nothing, a simple calibration error, but the inspector kept her job, and word spread through the maintenance bays that raising a concern was no longer something that ended a career.
Dean did not ask for public recognition beyond what the truth required. When Forbes requested a follow-up interview about his fortune, he agreed only on the condition that the story focus less on the money and more on the mechanics, engineers, and inspectors across the industry who had been ignored the way he once was. At the interview, he said something that was later quoted more than anything else he had ever said publicly. He said that the aviation industry did not have a shortage of qualified people. It had a shortage of leaders willing to listen to the ones already standing in the room. He returned to Kingsley Arrow one more time that year, not as a former employee walking out with a broken badge, but as a partner walking in to sign the final restructuring agreement. The conference room was the same one. The scratch mark on the table where his old badge had been cut in half was still faintly visible. He did not ask for it to be removed. Vivian met him there alone this time, without the board, without Preston, without anyone else in the room. She placed the corrected personnel file on the table, the one that no longer called him difficult, the one that now documented exactly what he had discovered, exactly when he had reported it, and exactly what it had cost him to be right. "I don't know how to make up for what I said to you in this room," she said. "You don't need to make up for it. You need to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person who walks in here with a report nobody wants to read." That evening, Dean picked Mia up from school himself, the way he did most days when work allowed it. She asked him, as she often did, how his day had gone. He told her it had gone well. He did not mention the interview or the signing or the headline that would run the next morning calling him the richest man in American aviation for the second year in a row. What mattered to him was simpler than any of that. He had told the truth when it cost him everything, and eventually the truth had been enough.
If you found this story satisfying, consider subscribing for more stories about people who were underestimated and proved quietly and completely exactly who they were. And if you've ever known someone who was overlooked the way Dean was, someone whose competence went unnoticed until it couldn't be ignored anymore, share their story in the comments. Those stories deserve to be told, too.